The Ontario Diagnostic Days on realagriculture.com is brought to you by the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, the University of Guelph, Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association, Grain Farmers of Ontario, Agris Co-op, BSF Canada, Bear and DeKalb, Corteva and Pioneer, Great Lakes Grain, Mazex, The Mosaic Company, Pride Seeds, and Syngenta.
Hi, I'm Bernard Tobin. Welcome to Ontario Diagnostic Days. We are back with episode number 6. On this show, we're going to have a collection of crop production snippets for you. We'll start the show with OMAFRA soil specialist Sebastian Belliard and agronomist Paul Sullivan. They'll discuss how reading soil and roots can take your crop management system to the next level. We're then joined by OMAFRA's Meghan Moran and Jason Deveau. They'll take us down into the crop canopy and share tips on how to more effectively spray dry beans. From there, we'll head to Lambton County to join OMAFRA corn specialist Ben Rosser and agronomist Chad Anderson. They'll share what they're learning from trials designed to understand how to better manage residue in strip-till corn. Soybeans are up next as OMAFRA's Horst, Bohner and Pioneer agronomist Greg Stopps assess soybean plant stands. They'll count some plants, discuss how many you need, and share replant and stitching strategies. We'll wrap up the show with robots. In this segment, OMAFRA's Ian McDonald visits Haggerty Creek robot guru Chuck Baresich to talk about the evolution of robots on the farm. Again, this episode, CEU credits are available for Diagnostic Days. Look for the URL where you can apply for your credits. You'll see that on the screen throughout the episode. As usual, we want to give you an opportunity to interact with our experts. We've provided their contact information at the end of the episode, and we encourage you, put your questions that you have as you're watching the episode in our YouTube comments section. We'll get you some answers. Here's episode number 6.
When it comes to soils, we're often left wondering, what is going on down there? And this is especially true when it comes to root growth and tillage. What's all that iron that we're pushing through the soil to actually do it? Is it doing good? Is it doing bad? Is it even doing what we wanted it to do? And what kind of environment is that leaving for our crop roots to grow through? Let's have a look. So we're invited in this field that a grower had disc ripped in the fall and then vertical tilled before planting corn. We'll see what kind of structures those operations have left in the soil and try to find any impact on corn roots if we can. And just to be clear, you don't need a full-size soil pit to do something like this. A shovel will do. Just make sure to get underneath the working depth of the deepest implement and also try to capture any particular patterns like shank rows. Now, in this case, the implement used was a ripper, which is a very particular kind of soil disturbance. And one thing that jumps out right away is that we didn't achieve a full loosening with this tool. So you can see here these wide V or almost U-shaped zones of loosened soil between columns of still dense, unaffected soil, and then that pattern repeats on that 30-inch shank spacing. The loosened areas line up reasonably well with the corn rows, but it might be a different story in a crop with different row spacing. And this kind of variability in density at this layer is not as critical as it would be in the surface layer, but it could still cause some issues. The grower could still achieve a full loosening in one of 3 ways: increasing the width of the point or of the wings, narrowing the tine spacing, or multiple passes, not necessarily in the same year. But this ripper already had fairly wide wing points the tines on this implement aren't adjustable, and secondary passes typically have to be done at a bit of an angle unless both the tractor and the implement have guidance, or the point will tend to run in the already loosened soil. So all of this begs a question. Was ripping really necessary? When we start to take a closer look at this unloosened zone, we can see that while it is denser, it's far from having a massive structure. At this moisture content, the blocky aggregates in this clay loam soil have shrunk somewhat and are separating without excessive effort. And when we do that, we can see that roots are making their way through this denser zone by traveling in an earthworm burrow if they can find one, or in the cracks between aggregates. This profile has a fair to good amount of these channels and burrows, and roots are able to travel through that density layer. And then there's something counterintuitive to compaction. A little bit can be a good thing. Denser soil is stronger, and while we usually think of that as a problem for roots, it does also help to carry the weight of equipment and disperse it so that it doesn't compact the deeper soil layers that really are our summer water reserves. In the end, it comes down to what the roots are telling us. So Paul Sullivan from Sullivan Agro has joined me to help us understand how to read those roots.
We've got a plant that has been dug up. We've kind of looked at the profile of the root system. We've got a root system that for the most part is very vertical, that's going down into the ground. We've got these roots that are coming down on a 35 to 40 degree angle. If we slice through and look at the core of the root system, the key roots for this corn plant and any corn plant is the first three nodal roots that some refer to as the money roots, and the first two roots pick up the starter fertilizer. The first nodal root picks up the starter fertilizer. The second root picks up more nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. The third root is more of a nitrogen and water root, and then we also have these additional nodal roots that are here that are going down into the ground, and they're picking up some nitrogen but more moisture. Those are tapping into the moisture supply much like a well would. The other thing that we can still tell with this root is the planting depth. So this is the mesocotyl between the seed, what was the remnants of the seed, and the crown that's here. And it looks like it's about 3/4 of an inch to an inch long. This one's a little shallower. Add 3/4 of an inch to that, we've got a planting depth of about 3/4 to an inch, to 3/4 of an inch to 2 inches deep. So that's what's supporting this particular plant that's here. So one of the things we see with this this particular root, and particularly these early roots that aren't necessarily visible, super visible here, is they're moving down into the ground on a decent angle. We saw before the roundness of the whole root system, which indicated that there was no sidewall compaction. The roots were able to get out, grow normally in a vertical fashion, grow radiating out from the crown. And we see the much difference to last year when we had a lot of sidewall compaction that restricted the roots. And so at that time period, a stress that we have with a root system where it's confined to that root, confined to the seed furrow due to planting conditions, due to too much downforce, just due to soil conditions that aren't properly fit, will and then maintain dry weather after that time period where basically that slot opens up, it seals out, and those roots are just confined to it. We've got nothing like that showing up here. We've got the radiant around, we've got the roots going down well into the soil. The root system that we had on this particular plant that we dug up is certainly a good looking root system. But if we confine ourselves to these first set of nodal roots, they're not super impressive. There's basically a set of 4, and then a set of 4 to 6 as we go down, and they're the money roots because they start to get the crop off and going, and then the crop moves from there, from a nutrient, from a moisture standpoint, and that helps to start the ball rolling on a properly developing corn seedling.
So what have we learned? Well, I think the deep ripper is probably not worth the diesel in this field, at least not for compaction alleviation. Those roots were able to go through any kind of density layer, and particularly in this very fine sandy loam part of the field, there's hardly any difference in the way the roots were able to penetrate until we got into the poorly drained B horizon, where they needed the oxygen and found those root channels. But that still leaves the residue management, and this grower does need some amount of residue incorporation to get the planter working the way that they need to. So they will probably move away from a deep ripper, but still do some amount of incorporation to get a seed bed that they need for the spring. Further reducing tillage on this field should be possible because A, this grower is already compaction conscious and running a semi-controlled traffic system on this field with equipment widths in multiples so that they're mostly running on the same pass and limiting the amount of compaction damage that's happening. And also with residue management changes in this poorly drained soil, this grower is starting to see success with leaving corn stalk standing until spring seedbed preparation and seeing much better planter performance, better emergence, better plant stands in the years following that kind of residue management. So learn to read your soils, learn to read your roots, and see what they can tell you about how to take your system to the next level.
Hello, my name is Meghan Moran. I'm the canola and edible bean specialist with OMAFRA, and this is Jason Deveau, our spray guy or spray application technology specialist. Thank you for being here, Jason.
My pleasure.
We're going to talk about more efficacious spraying in dry beans.
Well, when we're talking about coverage, as long as we've satisfied product choice, as long as we've satisfied timing, the better the coverage, the better the results. In the case of something like a fungicide or a pre-harvest herbicide, something that doesn't translocate, something that doesn't relocate, coverage becomes even more important. So can you tell me a little bit about pre-harvest herbicide applications in edible beans?
Yeah, most growers in Ontario are applying a pre-harvest herbicide, and they want to get those beans off before bad weather comes, as soon as they're ready, so that we have high quality beans. So they're trying to dry down all the weeds and dry bean plants in the field, I guess for ease of harvest, but again, so that they can pull off high quality beans and so that there's no green tissue that'll stain those beans.
Okay, so that helps me understand what you guys are trying to accomplish. And where I like to start in these situations is just forget that it's a plant and think about it as sheer geometry. We just talk about it as a target and the shape of the target and where we want the droplet to go. Maybe the target is a stem, maybe it's under a leaf, maybe it's deep in a dense canopy. What you do is you look at the crop from the droplet's point of view, straight down. If you can see the target, great. It's easier for the droplet to get there. If not, you're going to have to make adjustments to get good coverage.
So we hear coverage is king. Is that the same as more is better?
You'd think so. Coverage is actually more complicated than you may realize. When we talk about coverage, everybody thinks it means just getting more product to the target. And in a sense, that's true. Coverage can be the amount of product that covers the surface area. That's called percent target coverage. Think for a second that you've got one big droplet that covers 10% of the area you want to cover. Sounds good. But wouldn't it be better to have 10 smaller droplets that still make up 10% coverage, but tend to spread it around a little better? So that gives us something called deposit density, or the number of droplets per surface area. Then we can go a little deeper and talk about uniformity. We wouldn't want all those droplets just clustered in one spot on the target, right? We'd want them spread out so that we have the best opportunity to contact the pest, or in this case with a fungicide or a pre-harvest herbicide, spread that product around a little bit. And we won't get into it a whole lot, but another kind of coverage is to talk about dose, and that would be the concentration. So let's say you want to use higher water volumes. That does tend to make your product more dilute, but honestly, that's far less of a concern in this discussion than it would be in some other discussion.
So how do you know if you have good coverage or if you've improved it?
Anytime that a grower or a sprayer operator decides to take a look to see how they did, that's great. And, they could look for wetness on leaves, but it's probably wrong to wait to see in 2 weeks if you did a good job.
Right.
Immediate feedback is the way to go. And for that, we like to recommend water-sensitive paper. I'm hoping most of the audience has heard of it, but just in case, they're small yellow cards, 1 by 3 inch, that turn from yellow to blue when liquid contacts it. So in other words, by using these cards, you can see where your spray went or where it didn't go. And the way we use them is we just bury them in the canopy. We can put them in the crop down if you're spraying fungicides where the flowers are to see if the spray is getting there. You can be creative and staple them to the bottom of leaves. You can even wrap them around dowels with an elastic and hammer them in. And that gives you a sense of the panoramic coverage to see if maybe you're covering all the way around the stem. As long as you use them correctly, you can decide to make a change to your sprayer, check the water-sensitive paper, set it aside, and do it again to see if the change you made gave a positive impact on the coverage.
Right, and so let's say you've used water-sensitive paper and you don't like what you see, so what are the strategies to improve your coverage?
There are a lot of ways that you can go about fixing it, but because every single operation is different, there's no one formula that's going to fit everybody. So let's go back to the things that we talked about that define coverage. Let's say you want to improve your droplet or your deposit density. The first thing you can do is raise your water volume. That's been shown time and again. The more water, the more droplets, the better the odds. But with every one of these corrections, there's always a price.
Right.
And this is why we don't have the one-size-fits-all solution. If you're going to increase your water, someone's probably thinking, my productivity is going to go down.
Right.
Because now you've got more refills to worry about, and there's never enough time to spray. But it's not all bad news. There are a lot of different techniques, a lot of different strategies you can use to improve your efficiency. Maybe your fill time's a little quicker. Maybe you spray your fields in a different order. Maybe even your cleaning protocol could be tightened up a little bit. And it's a little outside our conversation here. But the best way to figure out your productivity issues is just to sharpen a pencil and time the things you do during a day. Only half the time you spend is actually spraying. It's amazing how the rest of your day gets eaten up by other activities. So that's one way. Another way to improve your deposit density is to use smaller droplets.
Right.
Every time your droplet size shrinks, you end up with more droplets for a given volume. But then there's the caveat again. The smaller the droplet is, the more difficult it is to control where it's going. They don't have a lot of mass, so once they're released, they kind of just float around. And when that happens, they can get caught behind the sprayer, they can get caught in the turbulence behind the wheels, and then there's the weather to consider. Tiny droplets evaporate, just like big ones, so their survivability is less. They may never get where you want them to go. It's not always the case, but it's something to be aware of as the droplets get smaller.
Right, the weather you're saying.
The weather.
So in terms of weather, it does depend on what product you're choosing too, because if we're spraying Aragon pre-harvest, it's ideal to spray it in a hot, sunny, humid day. Although if you're using Reglone, that's best sprayed in the evening or in cloudy conditions ahead of a sunny day.
That's right. So weather is definitely a concern. It's pretty easy for me to sit here and tell you to pick your spot. But if you are going to spray with a smaller droplet and you are supposed to spray when it's hot, then maybe that's not the greatest choice. Let's go on to percent area covered. Once again, we can raise the water volumes, and we've already covered the caveats with that. But you may also be considering adjuvants. We hear about them all the time, spreaders and super spreaders. And on the face of it, it seems like a good idea just to add a little to the tank, and that'll help you get the droplet to spread over more surface area. But you can't add that to the tank, particularly when there are products that say don't. The label is the law in this case. If they say don't add adjuvants, you can't. If you hear from someone in a coffee shop or there's a salesperson that says just add a little in, it does a great job, you're well within your rights to ask, where's the proof of that? Because adjuvants, while they have the potential to do a lot of good, also have the potential to do a lot of harm. So the easiest way for me to respond to that is to say, make sure there's actual data out there for it being used in your crop, and better still, just follow the label.
Yeah, most of the products we're using have adjuvants on the label, and we should just stick with that. Yeah. Okay, so what about uniformity? Fungicides and pre-harvest herbicides, I assume uniformity is very important.
It is, and let's go back to our conversation on smaller droplets. They're willful little things, and they're really hard to control. They just are. So some of the strategies for getting them to the target without having them blow off target are to slow your sprayer down a little bit. Why would you do that? Because that allows you to drop your boom a little. The closer your boom gets to the target within reason, the shorter the distance between your nozzle and the target. And that improves the survivability of your droplets. In other words, they're going to get there, right? Better still, you don't get a lot of wake behind the sprayer, you don't get a lot of turbulence behind the wheels, and that tends to suck the finer spray right out of the swath. So you improve uniformity by getting the boom close to the target and using the fine droplets in tandem with one another. And if you're thinking about productivity, it's the same answer with higher water volumes. There are other ways to claw that back. And I think that leads us pretty naturally into nozzle design. That's another way to improve uniformity.
Yep.
You did a Twitter survey recently.
Yep.
You asked your growers, what nozzles do you use? And you got every response imaginable.
Yeah.
Right? So let's start by saying, first, I'm glad hollow cones aren't a reality anymore. Yes, they make fine droplets, but the drift is unconscionable. It's impossible to keep it on target without shrouds or air, so I'm glad they're gone. Flat fans still remain one of the best choices we have for putting pre-harvest fungicides and for putting fungicides in place. But a lot of you may also be using twins, and those are the two fans that are opposed to one another. They could be symmetrical, they could be asymmetrical, they could alternate, and quite often a lot of guys will use them because they already have them. Maybe they sprayed weed or something else. Their primary design is for vertical targets. They're designed to advance on a vertical target and spray up one side and down the back. So unless your crop has a lot of exposed vertical targets like stems, and I guess I'm thinking the pre-harvest herbicide again.
Yeah, well, if we're talking about fungicide, it's, this is fungicide timing and the plants are quite bushy and we're trying to coat all the foliage. These are wide rows. Narrower rows would be even more dense. But if we're talking about pre-harvest herbicides, I think it is important to hit the stems. And if we think about narrow rows at the end of the season in white beans, it'll probably still be quite dense and there may not be exposed stems. But some beans on wider rows and beans like cranberries will drop more leaves at the end of the season. So in some cases, there are exposed stems or vertical targets.
Okay, so let's tailor the response a little bit. If you're in a very dense and bushy canopy, and it goes back to looking down at your target, and you don't see a lot of verticality, odds are those asymmetricals or those twin systems aren't going to do you a lot of good. And I'll just sort of amend that for a second. If you are using a canopy where it's a little more sparse and you have more vertical targets and you think, yeah, I do want to wrap it around the stem, then to use those nozzles correctly come with their own set of rules. Right. You do have to lower your boom. If you don't, then those droplets will simply start to fall all over again. They won't stay on their angles. And it just negates the fact that you have angles at all. It just drops like a flat fan. Secondly, and we mentioned this, finer droplets just blow all over the place if you have no means of control. So if you use twins with fine droplets, they just fade away. You need to use coarser droplets. They have enough mass that they continue to move in a straight line. And you mentioned that some rows are wider than in other crops.
Yep.
You might even consider drop hoses. We've used them with great success in so many crops. And the idea is the hose drops between the rows and sprays sideways. Again, reduces the distance to target, sort of distributes the spray all around the canopy, and improves the odds of getting the spray in there.
Right. So has there been any work done to demonstrate these principles?
Well, there's lots of studies I could draw from. I myself, I've done it in soybean, I've done it in lots of specialty crop, things as bushy as strawberries and as crazy as ginseng. And some of the things that we see time and again are that finer droplets do a better job of penetrating canopies, and higher water volumes with some diminishing return always end up with better coverage. But the ones I'm really thinking about were done by Dr. Tom Wolfe out in Saskatoon a few years ago, and admittedly he did it on chickpeas, but the work that he did tested all these metrics on a very dense chickpea crop and a somewhat more sparse chickpea crop. And I think we could liken that morphology to some of the edible beans we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think the project was 2 different varieties, and for sure we see different densities and different types of beans.
As I mentioned, Tom's work on chickpeas has relevance. He worked with one variety that was dense and leafy, like white beans, and in another chickpea variety, it was more of an open canopy, like how kidney and cranberry tend to look at the end of the season. Water-sensitive paper was placed at 3 canopy depths, the top, the middle, and the bottom, and they explored the effect of droplet size and spray volume on coverage. What they found was that coarser spray deposited more volume than medium or fine droplets, that is to say, more spray got there. But the droplet density wasn't as good. That's the uniformity we were talking about. So in our case, I think droplet density is more important. When they looked at spray volume, they found coverage tended to max out at about 25 gallons per acre in open canopies and 30 gallons per acre or more in closed, denser canopies. And that stands to reason. The more canopy, the more spray. But perhaps most importantly, higher volumes always led to higher deposit densities, more droplets per square centimeter with the higher volumes. So let's recap. Using the label rate volume or higher, and I'm thinking 25 gallons per acre to 30 for pre-harvest, is probably the right way to go. And a medium side of coarse, or I should say a coarse side of medium. And I know that sounds weird. You think there's just medium droplets in coarse. That's not the case. We want to spray with the larger size of medium droplets. Is a nice balance between more coverage from smaller droplets and controlling where those droplets go.
Right, and be aware of the effects of weather on your spray quality, and the product choice kind of determines what the best weather is. And if we're using Aragon pre-harvest, ideally the crop will be dry enough to harvest within 7 days, but more typically we have to be more patient, and it'll take up to 2 weeks before it's dry enough for harvest. So thank you so much for talking with me today, Jason. If you're looking for more information on all things spraying, articles and videos on sprayers101.com. And if you're looking for more information on dry beans and pest information in dry beans, check out drybeanagronomy.ca. Thanks so much.
Ben Rosser here, corn specialist with OMAFRA. Here in South Lambton on our nice hot July day with Chad Anderson. Chad, we talked last fall about some stuff going on in this field here for a little field trial we're doing. What's going on here today, Chad?
Yeah, so this farm or the field is operated by Burma Acres, Roger and David Burma, and I work for them. And this is a strip till plot that they established last summer on some wheat stubble, and they've been wanting to get to strip till in their production system. Their father grew most of their corn under conservation tillage program, and then they wanted to include red clover in their wheat, so they moved to red clover, which led to more fall tillage. Now they're in a stale seed bed incorporating oak cover crop, but their long term is to get to strip till and reduce tillage. So anyways, we established this plot. This is a very heavy clay soil here on South Lambton. The strips were made in wheat stubble late August. Bone dry conditions. The soil was really strong at that point, and for the most part the strip tiller did a wonderful job. We had really good strips made, but where the straw was harvested, so this wheat field was the straw was windrowed and baled off. We had nothing but troubles with the chaff accumulating underneath the windrow, and what it led to was a damp area that just didn't strip as well as the areas on either side, as you can see. So when we were out in the fall inspecting these strips, Roger made the comment that it's too bad we couldn't hand harvest or know what this individual row over the old chaff over the windrow was, how poor it would yield compared to either side, because do you quit selling straw? Do you invest in a chaff harvester or a chaff spreader on the combine to do better residue management? But all that volunteer wheat, which would normally be spread if you didn't harvest the straw, is now concentrated every 35 feet. And so I brought up the idea that for the St. Clair Soil and Crop Tier 2 project, where we're doing soil health assessments, Ann Verhollen is doing hand harvest. So I reached out to Ann and Ben, and this is what we've got this plot here this spring.
So Chad, we're in the field, strip till for the first time for these growers. What is the issue with these old chaff rows in this field, or the wheat residue management system as is?
Yeah, so
the lack of residue management that was resulted from baling the straw off and having that windrow has caused this just a poor strip to be made in the fall. That was pretty obvious last fall, where we had a nice friable darkened strip outside of the old windrow, and where the wheat straw was. There's the soil got more pushed than it got lifted because it was damp from all the added the chaff that was there. It didn't berm up like it should, and it's, you know, come the spring you can still see signs of it that it's not planted as nice. It's a little sunken compared to the off the windrow. You could see some cracking in the seed trench area, so you know it wasn't as ideal planting conditions as it was over here. And then on top of all of that, even though the volunteer wheat here was fall sprayed and then an early application before planting with the burn down, we still see the impact that the volunteer wheat has had on the growth of the crop on the outside of the windrow. So it's just that residue management has led to delayed corn here relative to off the old windrow.
So certainly from the growers' talks that I've sat on, or growers talked, you know, they never make the comment that in the fall you need that nice, perfectly fine seed bed that you'd expect when you're planting or trying to strip in the spring. But certainly mentioned, you know, a bit of chunkiness is probably okay, and that will mellow out over the wintertime. I think some of the key comments I've heard from growers is that, you know, some chunkiness is okay as long as it's consistent in the strip. You don't have hollows in the strip or some areas with too much soil, that it's made fairly consistently. And I think the key, too, is that all that soil is staying in that strip. You're not ending up with soil outside the strip. So maybe two major issues going on. One just being that amount of chaff and volunteer wheat in that fall when you're trying to make that nice strip in August or September. And then maybe the second one being still just that concentration of volunteer wheat that maybe didn't get all controlled in the fall time or regrew in the spring that you're dealing with when the corn's actually emerging, would you say?
Yeah, it's a damp, you know, and we're on a heavy clay soil here to begin with, right? So but these strips were made in August when the soil is as strong as it's going to be. It was bone dry, so it still never got really fit to strip. It never really got fit to plant, and even though we tackled this wheat twice, it was still a battle in terms of its competition with the corn. We were really quick to try and terminate this and to have a brown planting condition, but yet we still have consequences of that. So that residue is it's compounded to put this corn way behind to what it could be.
So Chad, certainly you can really see the residue effect in some of these areas of the fields we look across, but definitely as you look down the length of the field, you know, not the whole field doesn't seem affected. Just curious if any comments, is that a soil thing or topography thing or what's going on there?
Yeah, so like you said, you can, when you scan over it, you got this wave effect of every 35 feet of the windrow, but at the same time when we go this way in the field, the soil does get better. We're on a ridge here. We're on like we call this in South Lambton, a white ridge, and then it goes down into the hollow and the dark ground, and it's a lot more forgiving down there. Here, the corns, it's really in a challenging environment compared to over there, but it's certain you can still see, even when you get out there, it's just not as stark a difference.
But it's still there.
It's still there.
So Chad, you mentioned this is first year for Burmas to be working with strip till in their system now, in their operation. Obviously there's some issues now that they're into it that they've realized that things should probably change going forwards. What are some of those management strategies that might change to solve issues like this?
Yeah, and it really comes down to we have to figure out how to better manage this residue. So the number one question for us is, do we continue selling straw, and or do we forgo that and chop the straw back? If we do that, you know, a lot of the chaff issues are spread out, and we don't have that problem. If we stay with selling straw, but even without selling straw, improvements to the residue management with a chaff spreader, which I think we're going to see clearly by the time we get done with the economics on this, that there'll be really justifications towards a chaff spreader. And you know, even they would love to do that. They want to get back to red clover where they were. Like I mentioned, they moved away from red clover because of all the fall tillage we had to do and leaving the soil exposed in the winter. So, and the extra tillage in the spring. So they want to get back to red clover. Strip till works really good in red clover. They've watched farmers in North Lambton with a lot of success with that. But, you know, we still got to manage this volunteer wheat even in the red clover system, because all this volunteer wheat does is compete with the red clover and adds to variability in the field. And so it's really residue management that's the big challenge. You can, like, they're really happy with the way the stripper worked outside of this windrow, and we've got great stands there, but it's all about this residue.
So welcome again. It's great to be with you. Horst Bohner here with Greg Stops, and we're going to assess a soybean plant stand. Greg, one of the issues, of course, this time of year is just trying to get those beans out of the ground. We know that they have to push the seed out, that dicot, and it's more difficult than it is for corn. And so every year somewhere in the province we have some replants for various scenarios. So as we think about what to expect from the number of seeds we put in the ground, let's say we seeded 160,000 in 15-inch rows. What kind of a plant stand can I expect, let's say, a month after seeding?
Well, I think, you know, you can expect, you can figure it out pretty quickly, I think, with general rule of thumb. There's all kinds of other stressors and things that impact that stand, but under ideal scenario, right, you would take an average batch of soybeans and say it has 90% warm germ on it, right? Well, that means that 10% of those plants from your ideal seeding rate aren't going to come up, right?
Right.
Now, no field that I know of has perfect ideal conditions. There's always something else on top of that that goes a little bit wrong, right? Or some external stressors on the seed. So for a general rule of thumb, you know, 15 to 20% of plants or seeds in my mind likely don't come up or make it, right?
Okay,
some of them start and some of them make it out of the ground, but don't necessarily survive to form that final stand. So good rule of thumb, and, you know, take that number up a little bit depending on how tough your soils are, right? You're going to lose 20% from planting.
Right. So already we're down to about 130,000 if we seeded 160, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So that makes quite a difference there in terms of our expectations. So let's just ask point blank, how many plants per acre do we need to maximize to maximize yield potential on kind of a fairly nice loamy soil?
So, and I think that's a great place to start, really. The number varies a little bit.
Okay.
There's a pile of research out there, certainly. The number that I always have in my head is I like to be somewhere with a final stand between 120 and 140. That's what I'm shooting for. That's partly what I'm taking into account when I'm setting my overall seeding rate too, right? I'm thinking, oh, if I lose 20, but I want between 120 and 140, I've got to put 20% over that, right? To get me to where I really need to be with my seeding rate, bare minimum. You can achieve a full yield potential out of 100,000 plants. You can do it. Just starts to get riskier and riskier the fewer and fewer plants you have, because this is the start of the season. There's a lot to go. There's a lot of things that can happen, a lot of diseases, a lot of insect pressure. All those things can come, and we don't have full predictive ability about them.
And certainly part of the equation must be planting date, right? Because we know that late planted beans physically don't get as tall, so they don't have as many nodes. So we think we need more plants per acre for late seeded. I'm sure you would agree with that.
Yes, yeah. The later we get, and when we say late, it's important to define that too. the part of the world that I am an agronomist in, I kind of consider late after June 10th, right? Some it's the 15th, right? Then I really start thinking about, well, those plants are going to be shorter. I need more flowers in the field on a per acre basis, right? The only way to get that is more plants.
Right,
so
right.
up the number of plants.
Now, the second obvious question has to be around heavy clay soils. You know, we have some areas in Ontario that struggle to get real tall beans, and so generally speaking, there also we need more plants per acre.
More plants.
And I would say also further north, right? Because again of this physical shortness, they just don't have the time to finish.
Absolutely. So where you and I are here today, and we have this number that I just threw out, it was 120 to 140. That works really well across most of the geography I cover. You go outside of that, or you start to take into account these tougher situations, clays where the beans are shorter, or further north where you just don't get that same growth out of those beans or those earlier maturity beans, and you got to adjust that population up. So in some of those scenarios, that final stand maybe should be 160, right?
I agree.
All of that then factors in too to some of our planting recommendations.
So now let's look at this particular spot and see how many plants per acre we have. So here we are looking at a stand that's it's pretty mediocre, eh, Greg? I mean, I don't know how you like to assess stands. I still use the old hula hoop method because, to be honest, a lot of 7.5-inch rows, it's the easiest way to do it, right? Otherwise, I'd get away from the hoop. But the other thing that I've done is I just write on the side, you know, 12 beans equals 75,000, you know, 15 beans equals whatever it is, just so I don't have to get the chart out or whatever. That's how I do it. And so we assess this here, and we think there's about 80,000 plants. Yeah, you know, I'm not happy with that, but the question is, do we do anything? Do we replant? And if so, how do we go about that?
Okay. Well, first, I love the hula hoop method too, right? I think there's different ways to do stand assessments, right? The hula hoop is probably the easiest way for most of us. Gets a little sketchier when you enter into 30-inch rows, right?
Right, right.
Easier with a 30-inch row to do stand assessments, kind of like corn with feet of row, right? But here we've got the hula hoop. It's the preferred method for me and for you. Love your technique of writing down the numbers for sure. And we've gone through and we've counted to determine that there's about 80,000 plants per acre here, right, with this assessment.
Right.
So that represents about 50% establishment from what we dropped. That's a huge number in a lot of our heads, right? And it elicits that response that says something's wrong here, right? Maybe I should do something. But looking at this, Horst, the first thing that comes to my mind is it's fairly consistent. I've got a plant here, I've got a plant there, and they're well spaced. It's not huge gaps. It's actually pretty good, right? So at 80,000 stand final, it's less than ideal, right? But I still figure you probably have 85 to 90% yield potential there. So is it worth screwing that up when it's this consistent? And in my mind, no.
That's right. So if the whole field was like this, we'd obviously just walk away and say it is what it is. You're better off just to leave it. But now, the real problem is, of course, often in these replant scenarios, right, you get into a situation where
it's not always like this. It's not like uniform.
Exactly. And so then you have to assess, you know, how do you address those poor areas? So often we talk about just taking a corn planter and driving in on top. Do you suggest that a farmer change his piece of equipment or just use what he's got?
To me, it's more important to be timely than it is to go hunting for another piece of equipment, right? So I kind of say use what you got. Whether that's right or wrong, that's been my typical recommendation, right? And then it's figuring out, well, how much more do I add in, right? And so I like to take a look in multiple places, never just doing a stand assessment in one kind of chunk of the field, but trying to cover the entire field, trying not to bias myself to the good spots, the bad spots, right? But trying to define what are the good spots and the bad spots. And if you can define them, and kind of create a zone, then you can assess what to do in each zone, right? Hopefully you can do that and not have to go across an entire field if you're talking about replanting some stuff in or stitching some beans in, as I usually say. So really, then looking at how many do you put down, right?
That's a key question. Let me throw this at you. 50,000 plants, relatively uniform across the field. Let's just leave this, pretend that's the way it is. How much do you fill in? How much do you patch?
50,000, relatively uniform.
Yep.
I might stitch in as much as 100,000 more.
Okay.
Right? And it's going to give me a total seeding rate of 50 that are there and another 100. Keep in mind, 10% of those 100 aren't going to come, so 90 on top of that 50, and then a little bit of room for a few more to be lost. Because the later we do this, the more we have to stitch things in, more moisture is slipped away. There's more challenges that start to present themselves.
Well, and the other thing that's key about assessing what the actual problem is in terms of, was it slugs? Was it seed corn maggot? That might change your thinking, right? Let's say it's slugs and we still have a lot of residue. It's still fairly moist.
That might change my thinking in terms of upping that number.
Upping it up, right? Where let's say it was just I didn't get them into moisture, real dry year, we have that. Maybe your 100 is the right number.
Well, and the other thing with that too is not just assessing what's up if you didn't get it into moisture, but digging there too to see are there still seeds that were sitting there dry, because they might still come, right? If you dig them up and you find they started and stopped, then you're more clear to go ahead and start replanting a bit, right?
Oh, this has been perfect. Thanks, Greg.
Good morning, Ian McDonald with OMAFRA down here at Haggerty Creek with Chuck Baresich, and we are going to talk to you about robotics today. So Chuck, you're really into this stuff, and can you just talk about the platforms we have here in front of us?
Yeah, thanks Ian. Well, we have a couple of different examples with the robots, and the robots can do lots of different things. Essentially, they are all tool carriers designed to do different tasks. That's probably the best way to describe them. Not too much different than a farm tractor. And so they can come in different shapes and sizes. These two little guys, which are nicknamed Gordy and Gertie, are Neo Oz robots. And what we're using them for is for autonomous weeding of horticulture crops. And to my left is a larger robot built by Haggerty called the Romeo. And this robot can do various tasks. So we are using it for soil sampling. So this scanner on the front scans the soil and records it for us autonomously. It also can carry other attachments such as the fertilizer spreader on the back or the cover crop spreader on the back.
And you've tried it with red clover in wheat?
Yes. Yes, we have. We use it for red clover in wheat, and we've used it for sampling soil. And it can do other tasks, kind of as whatever your imagination can imagine.
And the Romeo is built by an Ontario company.
Yes.
And these ones are from
France.
France.
Yep. Yep. And these are, so the in Europe, I don't want to say Europe is probably a little bit ahead of us, more so just because of their cropping style and the demands of what they're after. And so Neo has been pioneering the autonomous weeding systems for probably close to 5 years. Whereas this robot, it was brand new last year.
And we also have a rogator sitting here. Why do we have how do we think about that as a robot?
Well, I think to make it a little bit simpler, the traditional machines like this rogator have a lot of robotic components in them that we don't really think about. As an example, this sprayer will drive itself down the field. So the technology that is in it, the human that's in the cab can push a button and the sprayer will drive itself in straight lines up and down the field. When you slow down at the headland, it will turn itself around automatically at each headland. So you just sit there and it turns itself into the next set of rows. And a new feature that's on it is there's a vision camera on the front that actually will see where it needs to be driving. So it will use GPS and a GPS positioning to measure, you know, I need to be every 120 feet. So once it finds that 120 foot swath, then the vision camera takes over, and it will, so that it will run in between the corn rows or the soybean rows automatically. And all of that stuff is robotic technology. That's all taking a task, driving the sprayer, and letting a robot drive the sprayer for you. That's what that is.
But in addition to that, you've got all the aspects of the prescription maps and that type of thing with the flow meters that are controlling how much rate goes out where, and you know, when it shuts off, and these types of things, which again has to be programmed in like any action you want these guys to do.
That's correct. And that's one of the things that we don't, when we think about robotics, as a human, when we hop into a machine, we drive, like we make all these decisions kind of on the spot. So when we hop into a machine, like we decide, you know, how fast we're going to drive and where we're going to drive and even what direction we're going to drive. We decide, you know, how high above the crop or how far in the ground our tools are going to be, and those types of decisions, we make those decisions right away. The robot doesn't know any of these things.
And we as people, we are adjusting those things all the time too,
right,
as the conditions change, which the robot doesn't know unless you tell it.
Right, so then what we have to do with each of these robots, and even on the Rogator, we have to tell them, you know, we want you to drive, you know, this heading, we want you to drive at this speed, we want you to stay away from these obstacles, don't run over that tree. All these types of things, we have to tell the robot to do these things. And that's probably the biggest difference, is that the robots they'll only do what we tell them to do.
So Chuck, what other parts of the farm have robotic component to them?
Well, I think robotics in agriculture, like it's actually not new.
Agreed.
And so we have, you know, used robots wherever we can. A good example here at Haggerty Creek is we have automated our corn dryer process, essentially using a robot, because nobody really wants to sit here and watch corn dry all night long. And so what we have done is we have a computer in the elevator house which monitors the incoming grain moisture. It monitors the temperature of the burners. It monitors the outgoing grain moisture. And it calculates, you know, how long does that corn need to be in the dryer. So it moves it through the dryer at whatever speed it needs to move automatically, so that none of us have to be here. Not only that, is it puts it into the bin that we tell it automatically, and when that bin gets full, it shuts the corn dryer off and lets us know that the bin is full and it needs some additional input. If any problems occur, like, you know, a hydro goes out or something malfunctions, the robot controls essentially in the dryer, if you want to look at them that way, they send us a text message, and I can actually pull my phone out and I can see what the error is. And quite often I can correct the error and restart it right from my cell phone, just like that, and from wherever I am. We're
anticipating in the future, as this type of technology goes out into the farm fields, that capability will be there as well.
Yeah, and another good example is that in the hog industry, a lot of finishing barns in the hog industry use automatic pig sorters. And essentially those are robots that, as a pig comes across the scale, it weighs the pig, it says, hey, you're heavy enough to go to market, so you go into this pen, hey, you're too light, you go over here. In the dairy industry, you know, when robotic milkers first came out, a lot of people said, "Wow, that's never going to work, and that's not right for me." But you know, that's been 20 years now. However long the Outdoor Farm Show has been around, we've seen robotic milkers, and now the dairy farmers are embracing them almost as a standard practice.
And it's led to other developments within the dairy barn as well.
Right, and what's happened is the dairy farmers themselves, they have taken their labor, which they used to spend milking the dairy cattle, to actually managing their herd and managing their farm operations. It's enabled a lot of other things within the, you know, so the, you know, which is great for the livestock industry. And I think within the greenhouse industry, we're seeing lots of automation in the greenhouse industry as well, in terms of, you know, spraying and weeding and climate controls, harvesting, that kind of stuff.
And the other thing that we've talked about in the idea of the livestock facility or the greenhouse is that it has a very defined space in which these robots are operating. And when we start talking about field crops and getting equipment out in the field, we're dealing with a whole different set of conditions that we have to work with the vendors of technology to help them understand that, so that these things can be programmed to do it.
When we got our first auto steer system in 2004, my brother said right away that, why do we need to be in this cab? You know, can the machine not operate on its own? And so watching the advancements in the livestock industry has made me somewhat envious that we're not seeing it in the cash crop business, which is what I call home. And I think the challenges that we see in the cash crop side is there's so many variables. Once you take the robot out of that designated space that you've talked about.
And controlled environment.
And a controlled environment. Once we do that, there's just so many variables that need to be controlled or maintained. The other side too is that in the livestock industry, the area and the quantities are more easily contained. I mean, you kind of know how many cows you need to milk, and you know how many pigs need to be sorted, that kind of thing. But as soon as you move to a field, it's how many acres can I plant today? How many acres can I spray today? Like those variables just sometimes aren't known.
And we've talked about the fact that robotics is not really a new thing. It's been happening. It's been happening in the auto manufacturing, and watches essentially robots, our cell phones are essentially robots. In agriculture, it's been more recent, but it's, I think it's on the cusp of something huge changing. And it's going to be really interesting to see how that all integrates together. Mm-hmm. The other piece that you have is the DOT out of Saskatchewan, and maybe talk a little bit about where the DOT fits relative to the things that we're looking at here.
So in my kind of view of robots, I kind of put robots into 3 different categories. So one of them is like a stationary robot, like we talked about with the corn dryer in the dairy industry. Another category is the small task-based robots, the swarm-style robots, which is like what the Romeo and what the Neo technology is, where you're going to have multiple robots in the same field doing certain tasks. And then there's a middle category, which is where the DOT fits into. And that middle category is a larger robot that is closer to a more traditional piece of farm equipment. So Raven has brought out the DOT for doing large, kind of less complicated tasks like spreading fertilizer, seeding a crop. They've also brought out their auto cart system, which is for an autonomous grain buggy. So again, these are more, I guess, you need less fine control, with that kind of middle category of the bigger robot. Where these have to be very, very precise. The DOTs and the auto carts don't need to be quite so precise.
There you have it. We hope you enjoyed episode number 6 of Ontario Diagnostic Days. Look for us again on October 12th. We'll be back with another episode. See you then.
The Ontario Diagnostic Days on realagriculture.com is brought to you by the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, the University of Guelph, Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association, Grain Farmers of Ontario, Agris Co-op, BSF Canada, Bear and DeKalb, Corteva and Pioneer, Great Lakes Grain, Mazex, The Mosaic Company, Pride Seeds, and Syngenta.